and we will stay on once Dr. Scaroni is done to chat with her a little bit.
Cool. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Claire Escamilla, and I'm super excited to introduce y'all to today's seminar speaker, Dr. Amy Scaroni. She's my PhD advisor, and she's an assistant professor in the FEC department, and also holds a dual appointment as an extension specialist with Clemson Extension. Her work focuses on watershed management and working closely with coastal communities to identify and address water quality challenges in order to restore healthy watersheds. She received her bachelor's in biology from Penn State, her master's in environmental studies from the College of Charleston, and a PhD in wildlife and fisheries from LSU. She was also the recipient of the John A. Nass Marine Policy Fellowship that sent her to work in Washington, D.C. for 2 years at the NOAA headquarters, and that really piqued her interest in outreach and science communication. From there, she worked for several years as a watershed restoration specialist for the University of Maryland Sea Grant Extension before eventually joining Clemson. Her work mainly focuses on the use of nature-based solutions to reduce flooding and prevent pollution, as well as the development of outreach strategies in order to ensure success. When she's not working, she can usually be found outdoors, often on or in the water. And I can say from personal experience that I've learned so much on how to be an effective science communicator from working with Dr. Scaroni. She's really taught me how to be very specific about the audience that we're working with, and then kind of creating intentional outreach strategies to make sure that we're delivering the information in the way that our intended audience will best receive it. And I know she's going to touch on some of those topics today. So I just kind of want to sum it up saying y'all are definitely in for a treat. She's really awesome. And I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Scaroni.
Thank you so much, Claire. Appreciate that introduction. And I will say Claire has some background in extension as well. So I've picked her brain a lot about this watershed plan, and I've definitely learned some things from her today that'll probably come up in my talk. But anyways, I'm happy to be here. I was hoping to be on campus in person, but due to some unforeseen circumstances, I appreciate Thea letting me pivot at the last minute to turning this into a Zoom talk, but I appreciate y'all for showing up today. So what I'm going to talk about today is the development of a watershed plan that I led for the Edisto Island watershed. So we just wrapped up this 2.5-year process. This was a project that was funded by South Carolina DHEC, one of their watershed-based plan development grants. I don't have everyone listed on here, but we had a really great project team that included several folks from the Baruch Institute, where my office is, including Bo Song and Brian Williams. We also had several Clemson Extension agents, Gwen Wallover and Charlie Greenthaler. We had partners from Sea Grant, Brooke Sari, and also Abby Locatus-Prochaska from the DNR and the Ace Basin National Estuarine Research Reserve. And even more importantly, we had 2 wonderful undergraduate UPIC interns who did a lot of the heavy lifting for this project. And then we had a whole bunch of community partners, and I'm going to talk about that as I go through the development of this plan. But I really want to highlight the Edisto Island Open Land Trust, who we're not just a partner, but really became kind of an integral part of the project team. So I'm gonna kind of go through a little bit about watershed planning and some things we learned on this project. And what I'd really hope that you take away from my talk, if you remember nothing else, is really I want to highlight how the collaborative relationships between the research side and the extension side really enhanced the overall success of this project. We couldn't have done this plan as effectively as we did without both the sort of research and outreach side. And I also think it's important to point out that when you're working with communities like this, the work doesn't just stop once the grant is finished. So our grant ended in December, and really the heavy lifting and the hard work is just beginning now that we have this plan in place. So as Claire mentioned, I am assistant professor of watershed management, but I have a 100% extension appointment as a water resources extension specialist. So in this role, I'm particularly interested in helping communities to address water quality challenges. And as you can see from this map on the left, there's really no shortage of water quality challenges across South Carolina. So South Carolina has roughly a little bit over 1,000 impaired water bodies. Some of these have multiple impairments. So I think there are somewhere around 1,200 water bodies listed on the 303D list for impaired waterways. So an impaired waterway is just one that is not meeting the water quality criteria associated with their designated use. And across South Carolina, the most common impairment is actually bacteria. So I'm going to talk about bacteria a lot today. And when I say bacteria, I'm referring to fecal bacteria. So from both human and animal sources. And as you can see, there's a lot of impairments. A lot of these impairments have existed for a long time. So, are they, is work being done? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no, to address them. But, just having the kind of regulatory arm of classifying them as impaired doesn't necessarily promote the implementation that's needed to reduce some of these pollution challenges. So one non-regulatory approach that's really increasing in popularity, I guess you could say, across South Carolina is through the development and implementation of watershed-based plans. So if you look on the map on the right, it includes all the impairments, but it actually adds in that kind of orangey beige color, is highlighting all of the HUC 12 watersheds across South Carolina that are now covered by an existing watershed-based plan. Now, if you look at that area that I circled in orange, there seems to be kind of a particularly dense clump of impairments there. That's actually the Edisto Island watershed, and that's going to be the focus of my talk today. So we did just finalize the watershed plan in December. It was actually approved by South Carolina DHEC and the EPA in January 2023. So just last month. So this is kind of hot off the press. Some of you may have heard me talk about this project a little bit before, but this is the first time I've been able to talk about it now that we have actually completed the watershed plan, which is exciting. So what I refer to as the Edisto Island watershed throughout this whole process is actually three distinct HUC 12 watersheds. So we have the Dahoo River, North Edisto River watershed, Store Creek watershed, and the South Edisto River Atlantic Intercoastal Waterway watershed. We essentially picked these three watersheds because that was the number of watersheds it took to encompass the entirety of Edisto Island and Edisto Beach, which I'll show in a minute. Now, I work on the coast. My office is at Brook. I actually live in Charleston. So I'm very familiar with coastal water quality issues, but I haven't actually done work on Edisto before. So just as a little background about how I came to be involved in this project, there was actually a group of residents on Edisto who have been concerned about the water quality challenges and perhaps a little bit frustrated that more wasn't being done to address them. So they did reach out to DHEC for help. They wanted a watershed-based plan, but they didn't necessarily have the local capacity or resources to develop the plan or to seek grant funding for the plan. So DHEC actually connected them with me. I was able to get the funding from DHEC to lead the effort. And so that's how I came to lead the watershed planning process. But I was very intentional about putting together a project team and a project advisory board that consisted of local groups and individuals who would be able to best represent the community needs and interests, since I am, somewhat of an outsider to Edisto. And in fact, one of our members of our project team lives on Edisto Island and works for DNR. So we were able to, make sure we had those important connections to the community. So here's the watershed in a satellite view. You can see here that the watershed is actually bounded by the north and south forks of the Edisto River. The Edisto River being, I think it's like the longest free-flowing blackwater river in North America in the US. This watershed is also within the Ace Basin, which is an estuary of national significance. What's interesting about it is it's hard to tell from this photo, but we're actually talking about two separate islands. So there's Edisto Island here, which is in Charleston County. It's a rural coastal sea island with fairly minimal development. You can see that there is some agriculture and there has been some history of forestry, although neither of those are too large at the moment. And then down here, we actually have the town of Edisto Beach, which is in Colleton County, which, you know, presents its own set of challenges that our watershed includes 2 different county jurisdictions. So town of Edisto Beach is actually a barrier island. It's more developed. It has a year-round community, and it also has a vibrant tourism industry. So there's a lot of seasonal visitors. And there's a great, you know, Edisto Beach State Park. And so I love this view of the sort of the land cover map for Edisto, because most of this watershed, as you can see, is basically water and wetlands, you know, with some forest. You could see really the rural nature of Edisto Island. And then down here, you can see that, you know, there is this more high density development on Edisto Beach. But something I'd really like to point out is that all of the waterways across this watershed are tidally influenced, and they are all classified as outstanding resource waters, particularly because they have abundant shellfish resources. And of course, a key part of the watershed, probably the most important part, are the people that live within it and depend on it for their way of life. So we really wanted to make sure that we included as many community groups and voices as we could on our advisory board. So we did partner with several community organizations, including, as I mentioned, the Edisto Island Open Land Trust, but also the Edisto Island Community Association, the Preservation Alliance. And then we had representatives from a number of other groups, including the Edisto Waterkeeper, some local farmers, a local resident who's part of the commercial shellfish industry, these representatives from the state park, the Ace Basin near, the town of Edisto Beach, Charleston County, and a few others I'm probably forgetting. But we really wanted to make sure that we created a plan that protected the values and interests of everybody in the watershed. So we wanted to hear from as many voices as possible. And so to do so, when our project kicked off in May 2020, which was an unfortunate timing because if you remember, the pandemic kind of kicked off in April 2020 or March, whenever. But we got our funding just as everything had shut down. We weren't allowed to travel. We couldn't meet in person. And our goal was to get out into the community and start talking to people and listening to people. So we had to shift to an online approach initially, although over time we were able to do a little bit more in person. But we kicked it off with a survey. So we surveyed residents to find out 3 key things. We wanted to know what they loved most about Edisto, what concerns they had about water quality locally, and what they would like to accomplish with the development of this watershed plan. So we disseminated this survey electronically through a lot of local organization listservs. We also had hard copies available that people could pick up around the watershed. And we distributed postcards, which was kind of like a flyer letting people know about the survey with a QR code so that as many people as possible would find out about it, you know, despite everyone being a little bit sequestered at home at that time. So we had a really good response rate. There's only about 2,300 people on Edisto Island, and we got 375 responses. So anybody that's done surveys before knows that that's a pretty good response rate. So we were pretty happy with that. And what I really wanted to point out is the answers we got to that question where we asked, what do they love most about Edisto? So we made a little word cloud. You can see the words here that stand out. Larger means they were listed, you know, with more frequency on the survey. So words like natural, wildlife, nature, waterways, lack of development, quiet, those really stand out to me. And what this indicated to us, up front, is that the residents really have kind of a strong conservation ethic and appreciation for the natural resources of the watershed. So in our mind, you know, we're already getting off to a great start with a community that's going to be really receptive to protecting and improving water quality. And that appreciation for the natural environment of Edisto is really reflected in the land ethic on the island. So nearly 50% of Edisto's high ground and marsh are permanently conserved. As you can see here, these areas shown in green. That amounts to about 25,000 acres permanently conserved. about 3,000 of those acres are held in conservation easements by the Edisto Island Open Land Trust. And of those 3,000, more than half of them are within 500 feet of a waterway. So, Edisto is it's pretty good along those lines compared to a lot of other areas along the coast. However, despite this limited development and the strong desire to protect the landscape, Edisto still has water quality challenges. In fact, there's about 19 or so impairments for bacteria and turbidity, and then there are 2 TMDLs for fecal coliform. There are a few additional impairments that I didn't include here because these were the 2 that we primarily focused on for the watershed plan. And again, a water body is classified as impaired if it does not attain the water quality criteria associated with its designated use as defined by DHEC. So designated uses are things like recreation, fishing and harvesting of shellfish, navigation, drinking water supply, and agriculture. So in this case, the fishing and harvesting of shellfish is the one that we're really focused on as the use. So as a result of all these impairments, many of the watershed's shellfish beds are actually restricted from harvest or classified as poor. And that is because of the high levels of bacteria primarily. So we heard from many residents that their primary understanding of, or I think we kind of gathered from our surveys that a lot of residents' primary connection or understanding of local water quality, and one of the main reasons they wanted to see it addressed, is to reopen the local shellfish beds to harvest. But we realized very early on that we need to be very careful when we communicate about these water quality challenges and the shellfish bed closures to the local community, because we really want to make sure that we don't want misinformation or misunderstandings to impact local industry. So there is some concern that if we just talk broadly about how shellfish beds are closed to harvest and there's high levels of bacteria at certain locations, then tourists that come to Edisto, for example, might be afraid of eating shellfish at local restaurants, even though local restaurants have permits and are harvesting from areas that are acceptable within the watershed. So early on, we really had to have our outreach hats on to think about how we would be able to communicate some of these challenges to the community without causing more harm than we intended to. So we try to be very intentional when we communicate. And really, people kind of get tired of hearing like everything's the doom and gloom, everything's bad, things are polluted. The nice thing about water quality is that there's an opportunity to improve it. So we've really tried to focus on emphasizing proactive solutions about, there are things that can be done. Let's kind of rally around that. So just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind with, when we get to some of our outreach messages. So going back to that community survey we did, the results of our survey indicated that about 3/4 of residents eat local shellfish. Local being harvested from local waterways within the watershed. And nearly 1/3 are actually harvesting shellfish themselves for consumption. So this was really important for us to know because we also found later on through some of our conversations with residents that not everybody is aware that there are water quality issues across the watershed. And not everybody knows where harvesting of shellfish is restricted or prohibited. In fact, a lot of residents throughout the watershed live on the water. They have docks. They are often able to access shellfish right from their backyard. They don't necessarily need to be out on a boat where they would be, able to pass shellfish bed closure signs from the waterway. So that kind of initially stood out to us as a really important, I don't want to say red flag, but something to take note of as we move forward with outreach for this watershed plan. So, what we learned in that initial part of this process is that Edisto residents really appreciate and value their waterways, and that these waterways are supporting their way of life. There's a long historical and cultural legacy around the water on Edisto and also around oysters, and oyster roasts and sharing time with community. So residents want to be able to fish and eat from these waters, whether recreationally or commercially. And as a project team, we want to help make sure that these waterways are healthy enough to provide for those uses, but also able to protect public health. So we kind of, after hearing from everybody, having discussions, we came to consensus on our main goal of this watershed plan, which is to reduce bacteria and turbidity impairments and reopen shellfish beds to harvest. So it does sound kind of like a lofty goal. You might be wondering, is this even possible? And the good news is, yes, we do think it is possible. There are several other success stories already along the South Carolina coast where communities, I think one area was the May River around Bluffton, and another one was around Murrells Inlet, where they had similar bacteria issues and shellfish bed closures. And within several years of beginning to implement a watershed plan, they were able to actually reopen those shellfish beds to harvest. So we do see some success stories, which motivated us, even further to work through this watershed plan with, for the Edisto Island watershed. So when I talk about a watershed-based plan, if you're not familiar, it is a very prescribed process set out by the EPA. Every watershed plan has to include 9 required elements. You don't really need to read through those. I put them on there just to show that it is sort of this formal process. And at the end of the day, when a watershed plan is submitted and ultimately approved and accepted by EPA and DHEC, which is our kind of state level arm of the EPA, it opens the door to EPA 319 implementation funding. So if the community gets nothing else out of this watershed plan, one thing we've done is we've opened the door to a pot of money that they are now eligible for. You have to have a watershed plan in place. And then if you want to go about implementing it, the recommendations within the plan are eligible for this 319 funding. So that's a pretty big deal. And that's something that we feel really good about moving forward. So, all right, to actually get started on the pieces of the watershed plan, luckily there is a long history of monitoring, water quality monitoring across this watershed, primarily because the areas within the watershed are part of DHEC's shellfish management program. So we were actually able to graph up all of the existing data for each impaired site within the watershed for both bacteria and turbidity. So this is a sample just from one site, one monitoring station that's been classified as impaired. It has actually been sampled monthly since 1999. And so we see that for all of our locations impaired for bacteria. So we have this, good, pretty long data set. What really, I notice when I look at this is that there are fluctuations in fecal coliform levels over time, across kind of time and space within the watershed, and that the target water quality standard specific to shellfish harvesting waters is a daily maximum concentration of 43 colonies per 100 mils. So this orange line right here is where the standard is. So in order to designate an area as impaired, the bacteria levels do not have to exceed this daily maximum concentration all of the time. In fact, they really only need to exceed about 10% of the time annually to be designated as impaired. And this is another thing that's really a challenge from a communications perspective, because since bacteria levels fluctuate, the water quality is not always problematic, but it is sometimes problematic, and there's some risk involved there, which is why, the area will be designated as impaired and the shellfish beds shut down. But there's kind of some nuance in that. And that's been can be a challenging discussion with the community if they're trying to assess their own risk, if they haven't had issues in the past in the water or consuming from the water, and knowing that it's not always kind of quote unquote polluted, but sometimes it could be. There's been some important conversations of when risk is going to be highest, such as, directly after it rains, but something to keep in mind. So, sharing, we're trying to be very open and transparent when sharing all of the data from this project. But we have to be very careful about how we talk about it so that it isn't misunderstood or misinterpreted. So here's just another example of a station. This is one of the sites that is impaired for turbidity. As you can see here, there's not such a robust data set for the turbidity impaired stations. In fact, they're generally classified as impaired after a 1-year samplings, 1-year kind of monthly sampling cycle. And, the daily maximum concentration here is 25 NTU. So this orange line, and again, you can see fluctuations with only, I think there was like 13 samples over this course of roughly a year. So only 2 samples actually need to exceed the daily maximum in order to be listed on the 303D list of impaired sites. At one site there was actually only 3 samples, and one of them exceeded, and then it was designated as impaired, and there's been no follow-up sampling. So there is, some of these decisions are made on limited data sets, which is another kind of difficult outreach and communications challenge, because there is some pushback from some against the need for an impairment for turbidity. And while the data justifies the impairment from the regulations, there may be some other thoughts on whether it's necessary from like an ecosystem or more practical standpoint. So that's where, we had all of this water quality data. I should point out that the grant does not allow for collection of new data or monitoring. So we had to do this entire plan with just pre-existing data across the watershed. And we saw there was a lot of data, so we felt comfortable moving forward with the process. And really the big thing that we had to do next is to ID the specific sources of bacteria and turbidity as best we could with that existing data. We generally know the sources of bacteria. It comes from things like sanitary sewer overflows, poorly functioning or failing septic systems, livestock, wildlife, pets such as dogs. There's a lot of other kind of pets on Edisto, like goats and horses and whatnot. And then for turbidity, erosion and land conversion is generally going to be the key source of sediment. But nutrients in runoff could be stimulating biological activity as well that could be contributing to turbidity. So we really just had to dig around to determine which of these, using our best professional judgment, were the primary sources driving the impairments across the watershed. And this was the fun part, and I did not do this. We had some very talented GIS folks that helped us on this project, including Brian Williams at Baruch and Anna Logan McClendon, our UPIC intern from Biosystems Engineering, did all of the mapping. I think Gwen Wallover on our project team with Clemson Extension did a few maps, and Nick Wallover from the Open Space Institute contributed a few as well. But this is just a small sampling, and I put these up here not necessarily for you to read them, but just to have like the colorful, beautiful background. We have so many maps. If you're interested in looking at these in more detail, I have the link to the watershed plan at the end of this talk. But we have, many, many maps. That was really a key piece of this process, and then being able to take these different layers, overlay them on top of each other, and look at some of the intersections really helped us hone in on some key problem areas across the watershed. But then, the really fun part after that is we needed to do some ground truthing. So after we did this whole kind of geospatial analysis, we also did windshield surveys where you literally just drive around the watershed and kind of look out the windshield of your car, and some boat surveys to better assess the potential sources that we had identified from this more remote effort initially. So from there, we were able to come up with a list of what I'm calling the most probable sources of bacteria and turbidity across the watershed. Now, this process was complicated by the fact that we didn't have additional funding to do any sampling or monitoring. We really needed funding, and we're actually in the process of applying for it now, to conduct some microbial source tracking so that we could definitively trace the bacteria in the water directly back to which mammal it came from. Did it come from a human? Did it come from a dog? Did it come from a bird or a deer? So we are seeking funding for that. now. We also had the challenge that DHEC doesn't monitor for nutrients in estuarine waters. So we worked under the assumption that turbidity is primarily being driven by sediment. However, biological sources likely play a role as well. So if excess nutrients are running off and stimulating phytoplankton or algal growth, that would be reflected in turbidity measurements. So we are also seeking funding for that as a next step to really better disentangle the drivers of the turbidity impairments among the probable sources that we've highlighted here. So that was probably, the most challenging part of this process. And then, we took these probable sources and we needed to develop a list of management actions or implementation projects that could be taken to offset, reduce, or even eliminate these pollutant loads. So these included like structural practices, things like living shorelines, vegetated buffers, cover crops on agricultural fields, bioretention in rain gardens in the more developed areas, et cetera. But also non-structural things like septic maintenance or pet waste education or enforcement of no wake zones in the waterways. So, management actions do not just have to be structural kind of like installations, but the outreach and education is a big piece of best management practices as well for protecting water quality. Because at the end of the day, a lot of our sources of pollution in these more rural watersheds are a result of human behavior, to either taking action that hurts water quality or not taking action to protect water quality. Just the very basic example is like not picking up after your dog when it poops. That's actually, a potential source of bacteria. And the way to fix that, there's already an ordinance that at the town of Edisto Beach that you have to pick it up. But, without a lot of teeth for enforcement, it becomes like a behavioral choice whether or not people do that. And so that's where education and outreach can really come into play. So once we identified our full list of recommended management practices, we had, sorry, my dog's like snoring in the background. I don't know if you could hear that. All right, I woke her up. So the next thing we had to do was to actually calculate the existing pollution loads, or estimate the existing pollution loads across the watershed from all those things that we've identified. And then we need to calculate or estimate the potential load reductions of those pollutants if all of our recommended best management practices were installed across the watershed. So if we do, septic replacements for 25% of the septics, if 30% of the agricultural fields use cover crops. If we go through, we can actually model what the existing loads are and how much they'll be improved after implementation. So there wasn't actually a one-size-fits-all model that worked for this. STEP-L is the model that is kind of recommended for watershed-based planning. It's a model that EPA has developed, but it really is more focused on agricultural and urban BMPs, which really are smaller land uses across our watershed. Our major issue is bacteria, and STEP-L doesn't even do calculations for bacteria loading. So we ended up kind of piecing together results from 3 different models. We used that traditional STEP-L model for our ag and urban loads and BMPs. We then used the Center for Watershed Protection's watershed treatment model for bacteria specifically. And then the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality has a watershed model for conservation areas. So we use that as well. And, we used all 3 of these with the goal being to estimate the water quality improvements that would result from the best management practices that we recommend in the plan. So a caveat for all of this is that it really is inherently difficult to calculate pollutant loads in tidal creeks. And these tidal fluctuations across the entire watershed are going to influence loading in ways that might not be captured by these models, but at this stage, it was kind of the best that we had to work with. So here's an example of the output of the watershed treatment model. I'm just putting on there so you can kind of see what it spits out. The details aren't important. But so we use this primarily to estimate existing bacteria, but we're also able to estimate sediment loads. These models are calibrated very specific to the local conditions. So you are, designating like local rainfall, the different soil types, the drainage potential of the soil, average temperatures, there's kind of a lot that goes into parameterize these models. And then when we input the specifics of our recommended practices, we were able to, spit out what the potential load reductions we could see if the plan's implemented. And so this is important when you go for funding. So when we apply for 319 funds for implementation, we'll be able to justify our request based on the expected pollutant load reduction from whatever practice we're applying for. So that was kind of the nitty-gritty part of the plan development. And then it became, then we kind of took it back to the community. So we took our results and we took our recommendations out to our advisory board and to other community representatives. And it turned out that the stakeholder engagement piece here was probably actually the most important step of this whole process. We were actually able to get information back from our stakeholders that we wouldn't have known just by looking at these water quality data sets or at the geospatial data that was available. And ultimately, we ended up changing some of our recommendations based on this feedback. And I think even, probably most importantly, we were able to hear about the community preferences for solutions. And that allowed us to make sure that what we put in as our final recommendations were feasible, and acceptable to those who would have to live with them. There's basically like a, unlimited amount of things that you can recommend. But if things weren't feasible, if they were very adamantly opposed to some of those for the community, then those weren't necessarily things that that we included. And again, a watershed-based plan is just a roadmap moving forward. It's not like this rigid document where you can only do things that are in the plan. So if people read our plan and have ideas beyond that, that's great. I'm sure, we may have missed some things, but these are really like living documents that can be built on over time. So the way that we did share this with the community was through several different types of engagement efforts. We did surveys, as I mentioned earlier. We did some participatory mapping exercises. We had to move those online. And so Brian Williams set up this really great online mapping portal for us where residents could go click a spot on the watershed and like tell us all about the issues that they were noticing there. So we did find out things there that we weren't already aware of. We also did some listening sessions with community representatives and several presentations to community groups, lots of meetings and individual conversations with advisory board members and residents as well. So that was a really, really big piece of this. I would say the first year we kind of did the basic plan development, and then the next year and a half was really the outreach, engagement, and getting feedback and refining the plan from there. So I'm just going to go through some of the key things that we found out. So just some of the highlights from this plan and our recommendations. It was really fairly obvious that septic systems are a major contributor to the bacteria issue. There is no water and sewer on Edisto Island. Everybody, all of these 800 plus dots that you see here are septic systems. We got this data from Charleston County. We just don't have the data graph or mapped from Edisto Beach and Colleton County, but we do have numbers. So there's another 1,200 septics on Edisto Beach. And then a small part of Edisto Beach is actually on sewer, but that's more kind of on the resort side of the island. You might think like, oh, well, the easy fix is just to connect everybody to water and sewer, like cost aside. Well, it turns out that that is not necessarily a feasible approach. The community is adamant that they do not want to connect to sewer, partially because there's a cost there and there are some low wealth areas on the island. But also because connecting to water and sewer opens up the door to development. Edisto has stayed rural primarily through zoning that limits density because of the amount of septic systems that you can have in a certain area. So you don't see a lot of subdivisions or big mow down all the trees and build a bunch of cookie cutter houses on Edisto. They've been able to avoid that, and that's something that the community really wants to avoid. But something else we heard when we shared these maps is that there were people that looked at it closely and said, well, I live like right over here, and I have a septic tank, but I don't see a dot where my house is. So we started to realize that our data was not, our data set was probably not complete. So we had estimated the surface water fecal coliform load from failing septic systems, assuming a 20% failure rate, which is what the EPA generally recommends using. I have a feeling it's probably higher on Edisto, but that is based on these 800, I think it's like 860 septic tanks that we had information for. But now we know that we're missing them, right? So we ended up, well, I shouldn't say we, Anna, our amazing intern, ended up mapping the building footprints across Edisto, which are all these like blue dots, and then overlaying that with the septic tank information we had and finding out where there were building footprints that didn't have an associated septic tank. And then she actually looked at it from like a satellite view to determine whether each of those that were missing a septic tank looked like a house, or if it looked more like a barn or an outbuilding that, or a shed that wouldn't need a septic tank. And from there, she was able to create a new layer that we call potential septics, with all the potential septics that are probably on the island, but that aren't mapped by Charleston County. We found another 500 plus septics using that process. So we know that we are very probably largely underestimating the amount of septics there and the pollutant load that's being generated. Now it's unclear whether the ones that aren't mapped, just the data wasn't available by the county. I think DHEC only keeps septic permit records for 5 years and then throws them away. So it can be hard to keep track of. But they also could be some unpermitted systems, which brings up a big issue when it comes to outreach if we're trying to reach out to people who maybe don't necessarily want you to know that they have a septic system on their property. So from our survey, we found that about 75% of our respondents at least did have a septic system on their property. A few even said they weren't sure, which was a little bit worrisome. But of those, nearly half said they rarely or never maintain it. So DHEC recommends that your septic tank is maintained, which generally means pumped out every 3 years. So we could see that that's not happening. And that is a huge problem because a healthy, well-maintained, well-installed, well-sited septic system is not a source of bacteria, but poorly maintained septic systems are much more likely to fail and become sources of bacteria to the environment. So it's also a problem on Edisto specifically because many of these systems are aging. We actually were able to have information on the age of install of the 800 or so that we did have mapped from the county. Many of these predate the current version of DHEC's septic permitting program. So prior to 1987, it was actually a lot easier to get a septic permit because you just had to do a perk test and it didn't account for distance to groundwater, which it does now. And also many of these septic tanks, almost 50% are in areas that are vulnerable to flooding. So either zones AE or VE, which are both kind of in the flood zone. So we know, it's pretty clear to us that this is the major source of bacteria. And unfortunately in South Carolina, we only require a 6-inch vertical separation between the bottom of the septic drain field and the groundwater. Most states around us require at least 18 inches, so another foot deeper than what we have. So as a result, because of our weaker standards, failure is probably going to go unnoticed by a lot of septic owners because, if your tank backs up into your house, you have a problem. But visually, you don't know if there's just a loss in vertical separation between your drain field and the groundwater table, which means a lot of these failing septic systems could be failing for years before it's even noticed. So we know that we need to focus on septic maintenance and replacement as a key recommendation of the plan. But where do we start? It's really cost prohibitive to, at least initially, to replace all of these. And not all of them are failing. And a functional septic system is not exporting bacteria to waterways. So we try to figure out how to prioritize the septic systems that should be addressed first. So we created this density map of hotspots targeting clusters of septics near impairments. We also added in some risk factors like age, soil drainage class, frequency of flooding, and a few others to really prioritize areas for septic maintenance, being mainly pump outs and replacements, either drain field replacements or actually septic tank replacements, which can be pretty expensive, but that EPA 319 grant funds can be used to replace septic systems on private properties. So there is funding available for such an effort. And then Clemson Extension actually put together some great septic resources, including this Be Septic Safe website. There's a little spot on there where you can sign up to get an email reminder the next time your septic tank is due for maintenance. There's like a fridge magnet. There's little, what is that? Like a toilet bowl plunger stress ball, which is kind of cute. A keychain with the toilet on it. I don't know. I think on the back, it actually has a QR code to the Be Septic Safe website. So these are really a great start for those who just didn't realize that they needed more regular maintenance. They just needed some education and now they're like, all right, yeah, I'll do better now. But what about those who don't, who might already know, but just can't afford it, or don't know and can't afford it? Or even those who might be concerned about penalties for having an unpermitted septic system. We really needed to find a way to incentivize septic maintenance and repair, particularly because we identified septic maintenance and regular pump outs as the key behavior that we want to target to address these bacteria impairments. So we actually worked with our community partner, the Edisto Island Open Land Trust, and we helped them get a $25,000 grant. It was only eligible to nonprofits for providing free pump outs and repairs and several replacements for residents targeted in our priority zones based on water quality parameters, but also targeting low-income residents to offset the financial burden associated with regular maintenance. And it can cost $300 or $400 to pump out your tank, assuming nothing else goes wrong. Some of these drain field repairs, maybe cost several $1,000s. And then every pump out is actually accompanied by a packet of septic maintenance outreach materials to hopefully help prolong the time, at least at that house, before another pump out is needed. Okay, so septic is our big thing. It's the overwhelming load, at least from our calculations. But a lesser but not insignificant source is bacteria and erosion from cattle in creeks. So there's less than 200 cattle on Edisto. There's not a huge number, but we were able to calculate the load using that watershed treatment model. And then we kind of had to decide what to do with that information. So what we've mapped here are just all of the livestock parcels that intersect waterways, because we know that bacteria does degrade over time. And so if they aren't pooping right in the water, there's generally a chance that buys you some time for bacteria die off before runoff from those areas would reach waterways. So we had it narrowed down to these areas. Well, our stakeholder engagement allowed us to narrow it down even farther because it became apparent that there's really only 1 or 2 locations across the entire watershed where cattle are actually seen in the stream, which can generate bacteria, but also erosion issues if they're going, in and out of the stream bank. So the great thing about partnering with Clemson Extension on this is there's some really good next steps where an extension agent can reach out to the farmers that he already knows out there, or, including the ones that we've sort of identified maybe as being our key target audience. And there's a lot of funding out there through the EQIP program or whatnot to actually pay for cattle exclusion fencing from streams and alternate water sources. So again, even though that's kind of a structural change, it also requires that behavior or that, farmer to make the choice to change how cattle move about on his farm. So the outreach piece of this moving forward will be pretty crucial. We also heard, we didn't really have the numbers for this, but there's a lot of other probable sources, including, at a smaller level, including discharges of untreated wastewater from boats. We actually heard that a lot of people do the kind of bucket and chuck it from their boats. And stream bank erosion along tidal creeks. We weren't entirely sure ourselves if this was a new or old issue, but we had heard from a lot of people that there had been a noticeable increase in boat traffic over the last 3 or so years. And we'd also heard and kind of witnessed ourselves that not a lot of people were abiding by the existing no wake zone signs, which is probably contributing to erosion. So, so moving forward, we had some recommendations there. There is a 77 berth marina in one of the creeks that it turns out doesn't have a pump out station, or didn't when we first noticed, even though it was required. So we've been able to connect with the Clean Vessel Act funding to perhaps cost share the installation of a pump out station at a heavily used marina. And also you could see from that photo, those no wake zone signs aren't all that great. They're kind of old and faded. So we had some talk about perhaps replacing signage just to make people better aware of where the no wake zones actually are across the watershed. And then the last kind of quick example I'm going to share is kind of a forward thinking one. So another recommendation we made was which areas we would recommend prioritizing for future conservation. There's a lot of conservation work being done in the watershed. I think there's 3 different land trusts that own conservation easements, and there's some other form of conservation, not just through the land trust. And so moving forward, could we prioritize certain areas for conservation that will have kind of the best bang for its buck in protecting future water quality? So we actually recommended protecting tracts of land, as available, as needed, from these kind of orange highlighted areas that over time, if they weren't conserved and they ended up being developed, would actually generate a higher volume of runoff than some of the surrounding areas, potentially leading to more pollution from the landscape. So essentially, these are tracts over 10 acres, not currently under a conservation easement, that are on poorly drained soils. And so in doing so, in protecting, conserving some of these areas can help prevent, I guess, future negative impacts to watershed health, really from development pressure. And, when we kind of with the lens of climate change and sea level rise in mind, can also allow room for marsh migration and better adaptation to sea level rise across this very low-lying island. And we were actually able to calculate that as well with one of these models, so that if, we could kind of calculate the reduction in future potential load if these areas were conserved versus turned into single family housing. And conserving them would prevent about 87% reduction in like a potential future pollutant load. This is a little bit out there, but it was a requirement of the plan. So it just kind of gives developers, or maybe not even developers, but decision makers across the area that look at zoning and look at where development goes, and a little bit more of a tool in their tool belt for maybe deciding which areas should be developed and which ones should be conserved. So that was just a highlight. I mean, we have a huge list of BMPs, but I would say those were some of the bigger ones with more substantial potential pollutant reduction loads, primarily on the bacteria side. We have one for turbidity as well. If you're interested in learning more, both structural and non-structural, we have a whole section on outreach and education as best management practice. Feel free to check out our watershed plan. It's available on the DHEC website, but we also created a project website, edistowatershedplan.org, and you can link to the plan there. And then what we also include in the plan is recommendations for funding. So there's a full list of, or not a full list, a long list of potential funding opportunities and recommendations for monitoring. So if you're looking for some work to do in the future, you have some research ideas, the Edisto watershed is really a great place to do it. I think there's still a lot more questions that we need to answer to better address some of these sources and make sure that our implemented practices are what's really going to make a difference. And the last thing I'll say is, I've talked about outreach throughout this, but we really operated under this premise of we want our outreach to do no harm. We want to make sure that we're going to share this plan. It's kind of hot off the press. We share it with our advisory board next Friday, actually, and then we'll launch some more public outreach efforts. But how can we share it in a way that is sensitive to kind of the reputation of the watershed and specifically the stakeholders within the watershed. We don't want to cause harm to the community, either economic or reputation or otherwise, in our attempts to improve water quality conditions. So, we'll be rolling this out with a lot of feedback from our advisory board, but we are planning on community presentations, designing a lot of additional materials because nobody wants to read our 125-page watershed plan. So, we'll have some non-technical summaries of the document, but also some talking points for local businesses that might need that to discuss water quality with visitors if they get questions. So those are kind of the next steps moving forward. And hopefully in a few years, I'll be back to talk about some of our success stories, hopefully in reducing and removing some of these impairments. So looks like I took up almost the whole time, but we have a few minutes and I'm happy to stay on longer if anybody has any questions. I'd be happy to answer them.
Amy, this is Rob. How you doing?
Hi, good. How are you?
Wonderful project.
Thank you.
Yeah, super. Hey, have you thought at all about recreational periods where fecal coliform might spike from the water, from the recreational boaters? Like, for example, after Memorial Day or 4th of July, that could help you to isolate, like, how much of it is coming from boats?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And in fact, we have thought about that in our proposal that we're submitting to get funding for microbial source tracking. So we want to time our sampling with some of these more significant events. Like there's a big boat, what is it, like a fishing competition or something every year when we know that the marina is full and like large boats are coming and going. So that's certainly one area we'd like to check. Something that didn't really come up, but we discussed is that there are some waterfowl impoundments, and it'd be interesting to see if there was a spike in bacteria, perhaps when those are drained. But I think that timing and sort of those big events also help inform where and when some of our outreach messages should go out, like when we should be out there handing out information or who needs to get it in their hands. So we've already talked with some folks about having materials put in packets for the property managers of like rental properties, because a big issue with septic systems on Edisto Beach is the house and the septic system might be rated for like, a 5-person household. And then you have like 3 families come and like pack 12 people in. And even if the septic system is functioning, it's now being overloaded. And so, yeah, so we think about that a lot. It's not probably well represented in the plan itself, but I think it will be better represented in our outreach efforts and some of our research efforts moving forward.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have question. My name is
Sure.
Ibere Anoze. Oh, please, my question is, how does this pollution of watershed by bacteria affect the people of the Edisto? Is there any particular sickness it's giving them?
So, potentially, yes. I mean, there's fecal coliform, there's E. coli in the water. So if they, there are times where if you maybe come into contact with it in the water, you could get essentially like symptoms similar to food poisoning, right? Particularly if you ate oysters that were from impaired locations while there was high bacteria. So there is that public health component in there. We have, moving forward, I think sometimes that's part of the problem in communication is people will say like, okay, well, you're telling me there's high bacteria. You're telling me I can't eat the shellfish. I've eaten it all my life and I've never gotten sick, right? Because the risk is not 100% every day, but the risk like fluctuates occasionally. The risk is going to be higher for people probably that have compromised immune systems or, maybe open sores. But something I should point out is that the daily maximum concentration criteria for Edisto is much lower than it is in some freshwater areas around the state because of the shellfish. So if people are going to be eating shellfish, the kind of considered safe level of pollutant is actually dropped lower. So these levels, it's like 40, 44 MPN, I think. I think there's some like freshwater lakes where it can be as high as, I don't want to say the wrong number, but like 140 maybe. So, you know, there is the risk to public health, particularly through shellfish consumption, but we are kind of erring on the side of an abundance of caution by really lowering that, that allowable level, if that helps to answer your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I had one question.
Sure.
So, how is the condition of the forest or vegetations cover in the area? So I think like forest helps in reducing the bacteria level by nutrient intake or like turbidity level by preventing the erosion. So how is the forest or like vegetation management, the cover over there is taken into account to reduce those levels in the
So do
project?
you ask how the forest cover is taken into account?
Yeah.
So, you know, we did include some forestry best management practices in our plan. There's not really a really active forestry industry on the island. I think there perhaps used to be more timber harvesting than there is now, but essentially Edisto Island is a little bit hard to get to. And so trucks that want to get out there to haul away timber and bring it back to somewhere like Charleston actually have to drive over like multiple bridges. They aren't able to make as many trips per day as they would in other locations. And so it becomes a little bit cost prohibitive to, I guess, to make like large amounts of money timber harvesting. What we generally see are there are a lot of heirs property across the island, or there are landowners that own, you know, multiple acres, and they might occasionally have their timber harvested for some income. But for the most part, it is a very forested watershed. And so I think, you know, the forest in many ways is probably helping prevent some of the turbidity issues from being even worse. But yeah, the forestry part of this piece was probably the one that we were like the least confident in, I would say, because there just isn't a whole lot of data for Edisto Island specifically.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording now, but